Panel. All of you guys were at big companies, largely Microsoft. So, and we probably have a lot of people out there that were working at Microsoft in the day. And so I think you can provide some real instructive lessons and thoughts on what that transition has been like and where things go once you make this leap into the startup world. But I just want to start out with a real general question for this audience. So if somebody is out there and they're thinking about this transition from a big company to a startup, what's the first thing you would tell them to do, or the most critical step that they should know about when making that leap? Brian?
So simple answer, and that is network. Spend as much time as you possibly can talking to people who've made that leap, who've started companies, who've been through the fundraising process, and make sure that that's something that you really want to do. It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be ahead of time. And I think in the Microsoft world, you live in this bubble, and you don't have to worry about things like finance and finding office space and everything else. So, like I said, the more you network, I think the more you'll learn, and the better view you'll have of what it's really like.
Forrest, how about you?
Well, for me, get ready to do a bunch of things you haven't done in a while. So pretty much everything has to be done by individuals as opposed to this magic thing out in the field that you don't actually ever see that produces billions of dollars of revenue for you in the case of Microsoft. Everything from networking, the office, hooking up the computers, fixing, getting lunch for the team, doing your own accounting, and most importantly in our case, actually learning how to sell a product directly to customers. These were all things that the larger infrastructure Microsoft magically provided, and it was a rude awakening that first year. It was like, wow, nothing happens unless we do it ourselves. And it just takes a little bit to shift gears and be ready to do that again.
Yeah, how about you, John? Where are you on this?
I agree with everything these guys have said. I would throw on that you have to build a plan. That one? I would add on just you need to build a plan. You need to think about, there are kind of two approaches that I've seen. Folks who go into it who don't really know what they want to do, but suddenly, for whatever reason, decided to quit or find themselves unemployed, and now they're out there floundering and they've got to figure out what they're going to do. Or the ones who've actually been thoughtful about it, have said, this is the transition plan, I'm going to do this over, say, 3 months, build the network, think about actually saving a little bit of money, how are you going to do health insurance? Those kinds of questions are good ones to make sure you've thought about it in advance.
So what has been the biggest challenge? I mean, Brian, you left to start INRIX. Forrest, you left to start Buuteeq, and John, you left to start Acumatica. When you were making that leap, and then those first 6 months, maybe a year of making the transition, what was the biggest challenge you faced in that first period?
Yeah, so for me, it was very clear. It was fundraising. You live in the Microsoft world, and fundraising isn't a problem. You just go ask your executive or Steve for more money, and they give it to you. But when you're off on your own, you don't have a brand. Nobody cares. Nobody will pick up your phone call. So it's really up to you to go out and raise capital. And in our case, it took a year and pitching 70 different venture capital firms before we were able to raise our first dollar of capital. It was a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be. So, you really have to think about it because, starting a business, most people think, oh, I get to build the product and, oh, I get to design new things and innovate. But the reality is for a CEO, your job is really fundraising for the first, 5 years.
And Brian, you've talked about this before, that you've thought your Microsoft lineage maybe hurt you a little bit in your fundraising, especially when you're down in the valley. Can you talk just a little bit more about that?
So it did. There's no question that the real money in venture capital is sitting on Sand Hill Road. I mean, there's only a couple of firms up here in Seattle, so you need to spend 95% of your time on Sand Hill Road. And the Microsoft brand in 2015 is not as good as Google, Facebook, Twitter, or if you're coming out of one of these other companies. So that's a barrier. That's a liability that you've got to deal with when you're on Sand Hill Road trying to raise money.
And Forrest, you had a little bit of an opposite experience. The interesting thing with you is we bump into all these former Microsoft execs all the time, and they all seem to have make this claim that they were investors in Buuteeq, the company that you started. So you actually met with success based in part on the Microsoft network you created. How did you do that? And maybe you can shed some more light on what Brian was just talking about.
Yeah, first of all, I went to Palo Alto High School, and a lot of my friends worked on Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park, a lot of my friends' parents, that is. And was a little shocked at how rude of a welcoming we had when we tried to raise money from the Valley. So we had several attempts, a lot of plane rides down to Menlo Park, a lot of meetings, a lot of quality meetings, but ultimately no investors from the Silicon Valley. We found our success with the community here locally, initially with basically 1 degree of separation, people we knew from Microsoft, so a lot of director level and above folks that we had worked with in product teams or in the field, and basically relationships that where I developed rapport and credibility internally, and I never thought that those relationships would follow me into the startup world, and they did. So it's a real testament to the community in Seattle. We then tapped into some angel networks, Mike Galligan and some of the Acumatica folks that really were instrumental strategic investors in our business. And ultimately, when we did raise a venture round, it was co-led by Concur, which is one of the best SaaS companies in the world, now part of SAP here, Seattle success story, and then Madrona. So we did find success here at home. It definitely was hard and a big part of any startup process to raise the money, but I would actually say that ultimately our operational challenges, which I can talk about later, were a bigger part of kind of like the thing that I wasn't expecting to be hard. Building a SaaS business, and particularly to SMBs, to small medium businesses, is a much trickier go-to-market process than I had been exposed to, again, because at Microsoft it just magically happened. Somebody else sold the products and did it very well, so we had to learn to do that ourselves.
So, Forrest, am I on here? No, let me grab the mic.
All right.
Yeah. So, Forrest, one thing that people may not know is we were actually embedded in the Buuteeq offices. GeekWire's first office was subletting from Buuteeq. And so I know that family is very important for you. And when you're at a big company and you try to make the leap to a startup, it's not just you making that leap, it's your family. So I'd be really curious to hear from each of you, how did you prepare your families for that leap? It's a different world. And how did it turn out compared to what you had prepared them for? Talk about that transition, if you could.
Well, for me, it's been actually a great thing. My kids are now 14 and 16, and I told them if they did a WordPress course, they could come work at Acumatica last summer. And so it really has become a family affair where these guys are in working with me on the websites and on some of the marketing, and I think it's been really good for them to get a real sense. I don't think they ever really understood what Dad did at Microsoft, and they very clearly understand it now. So that perspective, I think it's been good. Clearly, the transition has to be something you have a discussion on as a family unit. And my wife continues to work at the University of Washington, and so there's some stability still there. Not that Acumatica is an unstable place, but compared to Microsoft. So
yeah, Forrest, I remember your young kids coming into the office and hanging out. And how did you balance that? And how did you make that sale to your family?
Well, as probably not everyone knows, Buuteeq made a market automation tool for the hotel industry. And the inspiration for the business came from family vacations while I was working for Microsoft in Asia. In particular, we went to an amazing hotel in southern China, and it was the best hotel I'd ever stayed at, and it was the worst website I'd ever seen for a hotel. So my family was part of the journey from the very beginning. We actually moved to Chile because we wanted to live in all the countries of the world that start with the ch sound. So China, Chile. We were thinking of Chad and Czechoslovakia to come next. And we lived in rural Chile, where I wrote the specs for the product. So my family from the very beginning knew about the journey, what we were trying to build with the business. And it kind of culminated with when I took my son, when we were raising our Series C, which eventually became an acquisition by the Priceline Group. I took my son on spring break last year to New York City and took him to 2 or 3 VC pitches. And this is my 12-year-old. And no, I don't think any VC had ever seen a guy show up with their 12-year-old son to a pitch. And
did he pitch, or were you?
He added a couple of good comments because he actually knows the business pretty well at this point. And ultimately, I actually sat down with the CEO of the Priceline Group, who we were talking about an acquisition, which we then did. I actually had my son sitting in the lobby during the dinner. So my son has been part of the journey from day one. It's a great question. It's absolutely part of the entrepreneur's journey.
Yeah, I just agree with that. I have a 14-year-old son who was literally 2 years old when I started this thing, and now he's got the entrepreneurial bug. He's last year incorporated his own company. He's selling his own software, and he's really into it, and it's because he's kind of seen us along the way. But I would just advise any of you who are thinking about taking that leap, your spouse and getting that person on board is 100% critical. My wife was just kind of there along the way, and we went for a year, no salary, investing a lot of our own money in this thing. It went nowhere, and she just kept pushing us along, saying, no, you got to do this. This is always something you've wanted to do. And that was so critical. Otherwise, INRIX wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for that.
Yeah. That's great stuff. So the other big question that a lot of people have when they start out is, who should they co-found with? And we heard from some of our speakers earlier today that you really do need a co-founder who can complement you. Should you find that person inside the big company you're leaving, or should you look outside the world, out into the outside world, and find somebody who brings a different perspective? And maybe you could talk about this from each of your individual perspectives on this.
Yeah, so the key is to find someone who complements you. My co-founder came from Microsoft as well, but the point is, he had very different skill set than what I had in terms of, being from a developer background, being able to think about things from a CTO point of view, and I was much more focused on fundraising and sales and kind of product vision. So it doesn't matter who I think that person is, as long as they share your passion for what you're doing and you're very complementary in terms of your skill sets.
Forrest, yeah, I'm interested in your perspective here, because you founded your company with a bunch of ex-Microsoft people, and that DNA of that culture seemed to permeate a little bit of your company. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for anyone at Microsoft, you probably did the Insights color wheel, where you find out kind of your personality type on a color wheel. So my two co-founders were both ex-Microsoft, but we are diametrically opposed on the color wheel. So I was, for those that know the wheel, I was a kind of orange, red, yellow, and my co-founder is a green guy, and the other guy's blue, which means that we have great diversity. So we did have the common Microsoft experience and perspective, which kind of unified us, but at the same time, we couldn't be more different personality type-wise, and we get into a lot of fights, and it's very healthy fighting.
We'll talk about fighting, but I'm curious, what are the, I'm not of that Microsoft world, what are those personality types? And tell which one is which. Or John, you might know this.
You get into the sort of intuitive, who's action-driven, data-driven, who's more touchy-feely, and so it's a good thing to do. It's actually, you can do the high-level test online if you want to, and I've actually had people raising this up lately with me. So
does it help? That kind of helped then in putting the pieces together for your startup and getting those personalities.
Yeah, the way it's used in more in sort of general HR coaching in organizations is to help people understand other people's perspectives and where they're coming from. But I agree with Forrest. I think in founding, really being that active and thinking about people that are going to be pushing back on you and are going to be challenging you. It's one of the things, I'm also on a number of boards, and I think it's one of the things I look for in boards. It's a bad thing if you have too many people that are exactly the same. You get into groupthink.
If I could add just a comment also. I made a very conscious choice of working with friends as co-founders, because the business, if it goes badly or if things happen, might end the friendship, and that's a risk you take. But I'll tell you, working with people you don't love to work with is a bigger risk. And when I'm on a business trip in the Silicon Valley getting my ass kicked by the VCs, and I've got one of my lifelong friends with me that I went to high school, we're having a blast, and we're going through it together. And seeing Cameron Steele, who I went to high school with, get in the face of a VC who was not treating us with a lot of respect, that was one of the highlights of our fundraising, was watching my friend go at this guy in a meeting in Menlo Park. So those moments are part of the journey. I personally chose consciously to work with friends for that reason.
Oh my gosh, knowing Cameron, I would love to see video of that. That would be awesome. So the other thing, and we did get a really inside view of Buuteeq, so I won't reveal any secrets for us, but you guys very purposefully built your culture. And I remember John and I actually had a conversation.
We thought it was a cult, man. That was weird.
It was a cult. But you were very strategic about how you built your culture. And we heard from Kristen Hamilton earlier today about the importance of that. How did you do that? What were the key steps that you took to purposefully build your culture?
Well, we kind of got it wrong at the beginning. I moved to Chile, as I mentioned. Brian, my other co-founder, moved back to Texas, and Adam was here, and we were doing engineering in China. So that was the beginning of the beginning of the end if we hadn't corrected that. So we kind of rallied, got back into Seattle in one building, and really started to think about, okay, what is the culture? How do we want to perpetuate that culture? We happened to use a tool called Tiny Pulse, which is another Seattle startup, that allowed us to weekly survey and understand how people were feeling about the culture. And one of the questions, the first question was, with eyes closed, ears covered, hands tied, can you recite from memory the company's mission and company's values? And we had written those and stuck them on a refrigerator, but we didn't know them by heart, and certainly none of the employees did. So that kind of was the beginning of starting to be aware that there was a feedback loop where we had to pay attention weekly, really listen to what the culture was telling us back, and then of course construct the culture, because at the beginning it was just an idea, but it didn't really exist. And you guys happened to see it really come to fruition in that first year that you were with us in our office. In retrospect, it's perpetual, it's constant work, you're never done. It's, as you're hiring and growing, things are changing, the circumstances are changing. So it's something that probably general management, not just the CEO, but general management has to be thinking about all the time. It's really a group effort.
And Bryan, can you comment on that, on the culture that you've built at INRIX, and maybe how the Microsoft lineage infected that, if at all?
Yeah, so even before we figured out what product we were going to make as a company, we sat down and we said, hey, what do we like about the Microsoft culture? What don't we like? We listed this out and said, okay, if we're going to start a company, we're going to make it look like this. And there were things that we took from Microsoft, and there were things that we purposely rejected from the Microsoft culture when we started INRIX. And then we started figuring out, okay, what business should we be in, what product? So I do agree that starting out with that early is super important, because it kind of aligns the co-founders on what it is you're trying to do. We do our values kind of the other way around, bottoms up. I know a lot of companies, the execs sit around and come up with the values and stick them on a wall. For us, every couple of years, we actually poll all the employees and have them write a paragraph on what they think is unique about the company, and then we build a word map on the most commonly used phrases, and that's our company culture. And it's interesting.
You crowdsource it.
We crowdsource it, exactly. We're very good at crowdsourcing. Yeah. But then we use that as a guide for who are we looking for in terms of employees, and we're very conscious about who we hire. If they don't match those values, we don't hire them. I mean, it's totally okay for one of our people to say no hire, the person's a jerk. We absolutely value that. So for us, that is really key to how we built the company.
John, how about you? What did you take out of Microsoft that you put into Acumatica, and what did you leave behind?
Well, I think I had a slightly different challenge, which is I inherited a culture. And so walking into a company as CEO, it's already been running for a year. The thing that I thought a lot about, I spent a lot of time the first 3 weeks just talking to people. I went out on the road and I talked with our top partners, I talked with some of our top customers, and then I spent a lot of time with the employees. And one of the things I heard very strongly that people wanted was more transparency. And I think it'd be interesting to hear these other guys talk about this, because this is one of the dials as a CEO that you've got to think a lot about, is how transparent are you going to be? Like, you could come home from a VC meeting on Sand Hill Road and gotten the crap kicked out of you. How do you display that back to the team, okay? Because you're trying to, at the same time, keep a team of people fired up. And so you've got to be balanced in how transparent you are and thoughtful about it. But generally, I favor a more transparent culture than not. I've turned the dial higher than where it was, and I think generally the feedback's been very positive. People want to know what the challenges are. Where are we financially? What are the sort of things that we're facing perhaps in the marketplace? So,
how do you guys balance that, the transparency of the startup versus having a bad day on Sand Hill Road or losing a big customer?
So one of our number one corporate tenet is radical transparency. So we publish our financial statements. We publish the same report that goes to our board and our investors, we publish to the employee base. And we think that's super critical, because if the employees don't know what's going on, then you're going to have gossip, and it's not going to be good. So if we lose a customer, everybody knows about it. If there's a big customer that we're about to close, everybody knows about it. The risk, of course, is that information becomes public and it may hurt us in the market, but I think it's more than offset by the reward of everybody being on board, everybody rowing the same speed, and knowing when something critical is happening and they're involved in helping solve it.
And have people generally kept it quiet?
Yeah, we've never had a leak outside the company to the press.
We got to work on this, Todd. Come on.
Tips at GeekWire.com.
Right.
No, I'm kidding.
Speaking of which, we are taking requests of questions at the hashtag, which I'm tracking up here, hashtag GW Startup Day. So if you have a question for the panelists, that's probably the easiest way. Just fire that at me and I'll see if I can get it asked.
So here's a nuts and bolts question, and it's not the sexiest question in the world, but it's something that I know people struggle with. How did you find and pick your service providers? People like lawyers to do your incorporation papers, accountants to keep track of your books. When you're first starting out and you're outsourcing those things, how do you find those people? How do you know who the good people are? And what's your process?
Well, when I arrived, we were using 6, and 6 was clearly too many. It was a mess. We're not that big, and so having our resources, our operational team spread across that many, and it was being done for kind of crazy reasons. It was an attempt to try and save some money, but it was saving like this much money. It wasn't saving anything really, really relevant. So I spent a lot of time just looking at the performance data that we were getting, and it was pretty clear that AWS was giving us a much better service than we were getting with any of the other providers we were using. So that's what I grounded it in performance data. We moved all of our customers. I mean, we still have a smattering on other platforms for reasons. It could be some sort of certification reason with a government entity, but we centralized it, and that's helped us because we're now much more relevant with Amazon. We have a great connection with them, and they're helping us in the ISV programs they have, and so it's back to building the network. This is an important thing to think about.
Yeah, I just had, again, all boils down to networking. You need to spend that first year literally living in a coffee shop, talking to people, asking them who they know, who know people. And I literally spent 4 or 5 meetings a day for months straight in a coffee shop, and I don't drink coffee. So that's how you get to know names, and that's how we got to pick our service providers. Everybody said, hey, this is the best lawyer in the city, and this is the best accountant in the city, and this is who you should be talking to over here. And that's how we ended up building our group of folks that we end up working with today.
So network is continuing that theme. I'm curious about the pace and how you deal with pacing at a startup versus a big company. I mean, one of a startup's main advantage is speed, but moving out of a more bureaucratic company like a Microsoft, for example, you might be burdened with a slower pace. So how did you balance that? Was that an issue for any of you as you made the transition?
Well, for me personally, it's 100 times better at the startup than it was at Microsoft. And the reason is, at Microsoft, you don't control your schedule. You've got a million meetings and your boss and everything else, and you don't control it. Whereas in the startup, you may have a lot of things to do and a million things, but you completely control it. So I was able to go to my kids' basketball games and t-ball games when I was never able to do that before. But again, you're working, there is no end to work. It's always you. So as long as you're comfortable being connected all the time and pushing all the time, for me, it was a much better experience being outside the empire than it being inside.
Yeah, I mean, I started a company in my 20s and worked 80 hours a week. And then I started this company, Buuteeq, when I was closer to my 40s and worked 45 hours a week. I think as you age, you realize that working smart is more important than working long hours. Quality of life was great. I worked very, very hard, but I never compromised my family or my own personal time. And I think that that's something that somewhat comes with age. In your 20s, you don't know any better, so you just put in hours thinking that matters. But it's more about knowing what not to do as opposed to trying to do it all, because there's always infinite work, and you could always stay at the office forever. You just have to decide how to unplug, recharge. I don't meditate like I think it was Ben that said he meditates. I don't need to because I go home early. I don't know if Ben works long hours, but I go home and I see my kids, and that's my meditation.
Yeah, I think it goes back to resourcing of your time. I mean, I work pretty hard regardless of wherever I've been. The thing that finally got me at Microsoft was getting something done felt like lobbying Congress at the end. And so, I would have to get this bill written, and then I'd run around to all these vice presidents and try and get them to agree to it. And they would literally be these adding on the pork. Well, can you add this little incentive in for this other thing on top of it? And then it winds up, you go into the big meeting of Congress, and will people actually vote like they said they were going to vote? And so anyway, so you do that for a while, and I actually think I was pretty good at it. But at the end, what's fun now is you can get 3 guys in a hallway, or 3 guys, 3 gals, 3 people in the hallway, and make a decision and just go. And the trick is how often you do that, because you can be the CEO who is doing that 3 times a day, and all you do is send your team off going all different directions. So you got to be really thoughtful about when you make a scramble. And I'm sure these guys talk about that. Then they abuse the scramble.
Yeah, so this is an audience question, actually. At Microsoft, you had a big, powerful brand behind you. There had been a lot of work to develop that brand over time. So how much did you think about your own brand development when you were leaving to start your own companies, and how did you come to those conclusions?
Well, I picked an impossible to spell company name, which... So I read somewhere, if you're going to spend a bunch of your time and energy and millions of investors' money, pick a brand that costs more than $10 for the domain. And we did the exact opposite. We sat in a room, in the 3 founders, and we spent 3 hours looking at GoDaddy for words, and ended up with something spelled atrociously that worked for us at a core, because it's about the aspirational qualities of the boutique lodging experience. So our industry liked it, and it was fun to say on the phone. But if you took the time that our collective team thousands of times or hundreds of thousands of times had to spell the word Buuteeq, not a good choice. So I would go with something much easier to spell. Start there, and then maybe you have to spend $10 or $20 or $50,000 on the domain. That's okay, because it's going to actually be a really good investment over the life of your business.
Brian, please comment about this, because your marketing folks and PR folks were on me for 5 years about INRIX, that INRIX had to be all caps. And I finally relented when you said, it is actually an acronym, John. John, it's an acronym, so you should do it. And I said, we would only do all caps if it was an acronym. So you guys really thought hard about your brand. Talk about your brand development and how much ROI you've had on it.
Now, having said that, you need to know I got my name tag coming in here today, and they misspelled my company name. So for what it's worth, so to answer the question, we actually incorporated with a different company name. And as the company kind of changed what it was focused on, we changed the name again. And my lawyer at Wilson Sonsini called me up and said, hey, there's a company in Kirkland who's going bankrupt who has a similar name. You don't want to be associated with them. So you need to change it again. And literally, the funny thing is we actually ended up moving into the offices that those people had vacated. And literally, it was a ghost. It was completely spooky. But so to answer the question, I literally spent, a couple days sitting in front of a trademark search engine and a domain registrar trying to come up with the name of the company. And it is an acronym, and you do have to capitalize it.
All right, we have changed.
You might have gotten the panel here with like the 3 worst names then. I mean, Acumatica is not the best name. It was something that was inherited. I thought about whether we should change it or not. I actually found that we have some very good brand appeal with our customers and in the space we are, which is, cloud ERP. And it's with CFOs, it's with purchasing managers. And so I decided it wasn't worth, trying to pivot on that given what we had established. And that's the thing you sort of need to think through is who am I really trying to break through on this brand with? It's a very different thing if you're a consumer product than if you're something targeting a very specific, sub-vertical of business. Whether you're targeting realtors or you're targeting bankers, it's much easier to think of a brand that associates if you can be targeted.
So tell us a story about where your big company experience actually hurt you at a startup. Brian talked a little bit about with fundraising. Were there other things that you ever encountered where because of your background or what have you at a big company that you didn't get a big deal or funding or whatever it was?
Yeah, so probably the biggest thing for us is, Microsoft taught me an awful lot about running large engineering organizations and getting things done and human resources and that kind of thing. But it also taught you how to spend a ridiculous amount of time creating slides for your board and for investors and things like that. And I think you way overemphasize that. I mean, I literally wrote a 50-page business plan for INRIX when we were getting started and walked around Sand Hill Valley trying to hand that out. And literally, I'm the only person to this day who's ever read that thing. Nobody cares, right? They want the 6th slide. Give me the idea. Who are you? Why is this a compelling idea? What's your advantage? What's the market? Okay, how much do you need? Those are the questions you got to answer. But everything else, like I said, is just kind of irrelevant, especially in the early stages of getting the company off the ground.
I alluded to it already. At Microsoft, things just sold magically, probably because John was out there selling it in the US. So I was very divorced from the actual commercial aspects of the business and underplayed our hand in terms of really thinking through how hard it was going to be to sell a SaaS product to SMBs. If any of you are planning to build a business selling a SaaS product to SMBs, come talk to me first. I won't necessarily scare you off, but I'll give you some sobering insights into some of the complexities. It involves a lot of inside sales, a lot of hand-to-hand combat with decision makers that aren't always rational. So I wish I had been a little bit kind of more attuned to the sales and commercial aspects of the business before jumping in. We probably spent 90% of our intellectual horsepower figuring that out and only 10% building the wondrous product. So it would have been nice to have done that differently.
So Forrest, I want to follow up on that. How did you learn that as an entrepreneur? How did you train yourself? Because if you wouldn't have figured that out, Buuteeq wouldn't have sold for millions to Priceline.
Yeah, I think very consciously we looked around the area and said, okay, who knows how to do this? And Microsoft, of course, there's people at Microsoft that do some SaaS SMB, but it's not a huge part of their business. Microsoft is more enterprise sales. So our Microsoft network wasn't as useful in that regard. So we looked around the area and we said, well, what are the world-class SaaS businesses in the area? And I mentioned Concur earlier. We kind of sought out counsel with Concur, and it started with a coffee with Michael Hilton, who's actually backstage, is going to be coming up in a second, and he gave me some great advice and kind of connected me some of his network, and that network led to other network, and much later, 18 months, 2 years later, or Concur ended up investing in the business. But you don't have to have necessarily an investor that can be that mentor. It can be just some of the great companies here in town, and there's nothing in Seattle that you can't find. It's a world-class cloud software IT community. There's a little bit of everything here, so just hit the network.
But it does go back to that need to network, right? If you're trying to find a telefirm where you can run things for $2 a call at a certain quality band, networking around and finding someone who can recommend who that would be, that's the thing you've got to figure out. And you're right, at Microsoft there's people. There's a guy named Robert Jones who runs the inside sales team, and you just call him and he figures out who it is. And now you got to get in and figure that out.
So a reminder, just tweet at us if you have any questions, GW Startup Day, and we'll take a look at those. Todd, you got a question?
Yeah, would any of you ever consider going back to a large company at this point, whether it was Microsoft or somebody else? And obviously that can happen in a variety of different ways through things like an acquisition.
Yeah, Forrest is back at one
right,
now.
Absolutely, that's right. That's very true.
Yeah, I just went to the company party in Amsterdam for Booking.com where I work, which I'm just curious, a show of hands, who knows what Booking.com is? So in the US, most people know about Priceline because of William Shatner. So Priceline is the parent company, but Booking.com is the world's by far #1 accommodation provider. Check it out. Really good mobile application for booking hotel rooms. And we have 105 offices around the world, and almost all the employees are in their 20s. So it was a fascinating trial by fire kind of cultural moment to go to Amsterdam and be part of the company meeting, a little bit like MGX for those that have been to the Microsoft equivalent, which is more of an enterprise sales force, a little bit older in nature, just as much kind of like orgy sex going on and drunkenness and people missing planes as at MGX. So it was a fascinating cultural, reacquaintance with the corporate world, same but different. I'm personally very excited about the scale that a large organization offers, and I'm having a lot of fun being back in a big business and kind of putting our foot on the gas on growing our customer acquisition process.
So Forrest, talk a little bit more about that, because now you are transitioning back to a big company. What's the pain of once you've done your startup, it's your baby, then you sell, and now you're part of this other corporate culture? Has that created any sort of tension or problems for you?
The four horsemen of the apocalypse are IT, finance, facilities, and HR, which we've had to integrate back into a large company. And as I mentioned earlier, when we were starting up, we did all that ourselves, local vendors, very scrappy, very much owning those processes. So I think that's been the only challenge of going back to a big business, integrating our own business, but also just personally, is taking that dependency on these large organizations. So that's been a little bit challenging. But the upside, of course, is just the scale. We have a 2,500 person sales force that talks to 600,000 hotels every day. And that's something we were not seeing organically growing with our customer acquisition costs model. So I'm really excited about that scale.
John, how about you? Would you consider going back to a big company?
It would depend on the company and the terms. I'd really have to think hard about it. I'm having a lot of fun now working in smaller organizations, and one of the funnest things, I mentioned I'm on 4 boards and I've done some angel investing, and that in some ways is the funnest thing I get to do these days. So I could see doing more of that and less of big company.
No, never.
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
It's just way too much fun being your own boss. The highs are higher, the lows are lower, right? So you're always on this kind of roller coaster. You have good days, bad days. But here's the thing, right? Microsoft, you'd go in every day and you'd complain about X, Y, or Z because something was out of your control. Every day I walk into work, I can't complain about a thing, because if there's something broke, I got to go fix it. So at the end of the day, it's much more empowering, it's much more fun. And when you see these people who start to build their careers, their lives, their families kind of around your company, that to me is just awesome.
So this is a little bit of an offbeat question, but since we have you up here and you all worked at Microsoft, how do you think Satya Nadella is doing at Microsoft? Because one of his big pushes is to try to inject a startup culture into Microsoft. Is he going to be successful with that? Can that place get more entrepreneurial in your view, or not?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think he's pushing hard. I had the pleasure of having lunch with him about 6 weeks ago. It was kind of fun. He ran the Dynamics team, which is the Microsoft ERP product. And so I pulled out my tablet, was an iPad, and did a demo of Acumatica on it for him. That was kind of fun. And but he spent a lot of time asking me questions. What's it like out there? What's going on? What should we be doing more of? So he's clearly listening, and I think that's the most important place they got to start. And then he's got to figure out, whether, he's got some barriers he's going to have to break through. He's going to have to break a little bit of the China.
How about you, Bryan? Do you think he can get that Microsoft to be more entrepreneurial, and what would it take?
Well, so the answer is yes. I mean, I know Satya. He's a great guy, very smart, and certainly out of anybody they could have picked for that role, he's the right guy. Now, Microsoft's a big ship. It's very, very hard to turn a big ship like that on a dime and change a culture of a company. I used to work at Ford Motor Company, very big company, but you know what? Al Mulally was able to kind of turn that thing around. I think Satya, out of anybody, if someone's got a chance, it's going to be him, and I think he's making all the right steps so far.
Forrest, let's get your quick thoughts on that.
I did not know Satya. I've heard great things about him. I would say no, because what you said earlier, Bryan, the culture, at that scale, the culture is at the very bottom all the way up. I don't know that the CEO really has all that much power or influence to do anything at the company. I think it's fascinating to see what he gets attributed for like his new leadership. I think everything that's happened in the last 2 years is just the stuff that Steve Ballmer had set up that's now happening, and Satya happens to be there. I mean, start with the iPad strategy, bullshit. That was always going to happen. It was sitting there ready. I know people that worked on that product. It was like ready to ship. They had some contractual thing with Apple. It shipped. Satya's like, woohoo, he's changed the ship. I don't think so. I think it's a great company, by the way. I love Microsoft, but I don't know how much a CEO can really do.
I think there's some truth in that, definitely, Forrest. But when you look at things like the Courier project that ended up getting killed internally, and then you see what's actually coming out, things like the HoloLens that was unveiled last week, my hunch is that HoloLens might have gotten killed if Steve Ballmer was still around. That's just my hunch. And by the way, Forrest, your MGX comments are now officially trending on Twitter.
That was MGX back in like 1992, so I don't know we obviously should all go join bookings.com.
I went to a different part of MGX, I guess.
Yeah. So we've just got a few minutes left. I want to just ask one last question as it relates to the topic of making this leap out of a big company to a startup. What's been the hardest thing? What's been the most difficult thing as an entrepreneur to grasp and to do in making that transition for each of you?
Go ahead, Bryan.
So for me, it's the ego. Meaning, at Microsoft, people care what you say because you have the word Microsoft on your business card. You go to conferences, people talk to you. When you make that jump into the startup, nobody cares who you are. Nobody cares what's on your business card. You can make up whatever cool brand name you want. Nobody knows what it is. So for a company like us, and our customers are BMW and Audi and Ford and Weather Company and MapQuest, big Fortune 500 companies, how do you even get a meeting? How do you even get someone to pick up the phone? And that to me was the biggest eye-opener. You go from being somebody to being nobody overnight, and you got to start all over from scratch.
It can be very lonely to be an entrepreneur and a CEO in particular. I think it's really important to network with other CEOs, other entrepreneurs, because that's your kind of therapy and help session. No one can really understand some of the stress and pressure you go through. There's a lot of transparency. I think transparency is great, but there's certain things you don't want to tell the team, like when you're going to miss payroll in 2 weeks. The team doesn't need to hear that. We probably were down to our last 2 weeks of cash, 5 times in 5 years. So that's a lonely place to be, and it's very different than being at Microsoft, where there's a lot of resources and a lot of colleagues and a lot of things to support you. You won't have that as an entrepreneur, but what you will have as a team, and you'll succeed together as a team. As the founder, you'll also need to have a network of other founders and other people carrying that weight.
I think that's great to hear, Forrest, that there were times that were that challenging, because everybody sort of hears these success stories and they don't always hear the parts that were really, really hard. For me, the biggest challenge, and it's sort of what makes the job interesting too, is you have a set of dials. They are resource dials. How much are you putting into engineering? How much are you putting into sales? How much should you go vertical? How much should you drive your channel? Do you go into England? Those are the sorts of things that I'm wrestling with, and I get one of those wrong, and it could have a huge impact back on the company. And so to me, in some ways, that's the biggest challenge, but it's also why it's fun.
Awesome. Well, great, guys. A big thanks to our panel here, Bryan Mistele, CEO of INRIX, Forrest Key of Priceline Group, Booking.com, and Jon Roskill of Acumatica. Thank you for a great discussion and for being part of Startup Day. Thanks so much.
Great stuff.